Hey, welcome to the Backyard Professor live show. I am the Backyard Professor and I am live, and you people are alive, which is a good thing. My regular schedule couldn't work out this week, and it's all good. We will, Colby Reddish and Rebecca Biblioteca, my lovely dear friends, have to postpone a little bit. No worries. We have a boatload of materials that we can focus on with this utterly fascinating subject of the historical Jesus. And it really doesn't matter, to me at least, what you think of Jesus. It's all good. It doesn't matter. You can go ahead and believe the Catholic version, the Mormon version, the atheist version, the mythicist view, the historian's view, whatever. It is the discussion of this topic that keeps us going with it. What a great age to be alive, to be able to discuss so many fascinating things. So let's get this show on the road, and we're going to meet Jesus tonight. Woohoo! And no, he's not coming to the Salt Lake Temple. He's coming on the Backyard Professor live show. Quit touching the buttons, you dingling. You're going to wreck the introduction. Sorry, I hit the silent button briefly there during the introduction, and that completely blew the show out. So nobody else is here anymore, and so you've all gone home because Backyard Professor blew his introduction. Hey, thank you all for being here tonight. Kind of low-key tonight in some respects and high-key in others. Let's take a look at who is here. Crystal Christensen, thank you for that very kind and wonderful comment. That just makes my whole night. I appreciate you. You're awesome. She said, I'm going to put your comment on. I'm thankful to have found your channel, BYP. This is one of the best podcasts I've been watching and following. That's very kind. Considering the magnitude of the excellent and exquisite podcasts out there, I am deeply honored. And Alan Zabriskie, Carrie is one smart cookie. Yeah, I'm an Oreo. Creamy on the inside, crusty on the outside. I'm a crusty old curmudgeon. No, I'm just over 60, so I don't give a flying flip. Hey, by the way, I don't give a flying flip what I wear or what I say sometimes. But this is a very appropriate shirt. It's just a flesh wound. Yes, Monty Python, it's just a flesh wound. Come on, you coward. Speaking of the historical Jesus, we're going to be talking about a lot of flesh wounds in the historical and the mythicist ideas and discuss them. Rebecca Biblioteca, my darling, how are you doing? Oh, Landon Brophy, stud of studs. Tim Rathbone, stud of studs. Doug Vincent, stud of studs. Dan Vogel, stud of studs. Boy, you guys are all stud of studs. Wanda Anthony, thank you. Mosia. Good to see ya. Newton Lemos. Yeah, baby. Yeah, baby. That's for Mark Crispin, who hasn't showed up yet. Peter Higgs, welcome from down under, mate. Love having you here. Daisy May, Wanda Anthony. Let's see. Elisa Galline, good to see you as always. Okay, so here we are trying to figure out what in the Sam Hill is going on. Now, I'm doing something that is another type of a research project that has parallels to this historical Jesus thing. Very interestingly, I am writing a novel. and I am writing a book, and I have written 200 pages in the last couple of months, and I'm doing some very serious research in this so that I can get it right. And it is an absolute blast. I'm following after my daughter's lead, who is a terrific novelist, Katie Cross. She has written, I've got like 17 or 20 of her books. She's written 61 of them. The Network series, Katie-Cross. Look her up if you think I'm joking. She is phenomenal. But I am writing a fantasy novel. And in the process, one of the true characteristics that fantasy novelists have to do is they have to understand J.R.R. Tolkien. And the more we learn about that utterly magnificent man and his tremendous mental power and his books, his works, his themes, the truths he taught through fiction, etc., the more we can appreciate him. So I have done something. I don't have the whole collection yet, but I will get it. But I have just recently acquired the Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle Earth. Now, Christopher Tolkien edited this. He was the estate, the guy in charge, his son, after J.R.R. died. Shaping of Middle Earth, the history of Middle Earth. I have one of those. I have the Tolkien Reader. And in this book, there is a really difficult to get yet very important subject. Fantastic analysis called Tree and Leaf. And I read this yesterday. And it's a very excellent, it's on fairy stories. It's on the fairy tale. What is a fairy tale? And it's very exquisitely interesting from the Tolkien powerhouse mentality. And then I've got the Book of Lost Tales of Middle Earth 1 and 2. And I have bought the Silmarillion. Now, I've been watching videos on Tolkien and to help me with my writing. And this one is supposed to be very, very important. So I'm looking forward to reading it. And of course, I've got the granddaddy of them all. I bought the 50th year anniversary of The Lord of the Rings, who was none other than Gandalf, right? Wrong! Isn't it a remarkable idea that Sauron is the Lord of the Rings, and he only makes his appearance once and just briefly in all of the movies Peter Jackson put together. Same with the book. And yet the whole thing is about the Lord of the Rings. Fascinating idea. So anyway, my novel will be finished. I am hoping. I am not fast like my daughter, nor prolific like Tolkien, so I'm going to put my whole heart and soul into this for the next several months anyway. Maybe I'll get it out by spring. We'll see. I am at 200 pages already. I'm working on the 13th chapter, and it's a great topic, and I put some really good stuff in it. So anyway, that's enough about me and my book. But the reason I wanted to bring up Tolkien and my efforts at writing novels and my daughter's efforts. She's written Sister Witches, Rise of the Demigods, The Forgotten Gods, Flame, War of the Gods, etc., all having to do with witches and warlocks and dragons and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. No, this is not Wizard of Oz stuff. This is really seriously interesting. Tolkien is literature. I really wish I would have taken that class when I was in college on Tolkien as literature. I was too stupid, narrow-minded of a Mormon to do that, so kind of pisses me off, but oh well, I'll get over it. Tonight, the reason I brought this up is because of the mythological elements. We really have an interesting comparison contrast with the biblical materials in the Gospels happening in a place on earth that we have access to, whereas Tolkien's Middle Earth is entirely a creation. As such, get this, it's not fake. Middle Earth is real. And you won't grasp why I'm saying that unless you begin to read Tolkien's own description of what he meant by real. And he meant real because the imagination is not mythical or false or fake. It's very, very real. And through the imagination, Middle Earth came to be, and it is a real place. And I want to go on record saying I'm with Tolkien on that because I've read a little bit of his stuff. So if you haven't, you're going to think I've already lost my marbles. And I get it. It's all good. With the Book of Mormon, we have the land of the Nephites and Lamanites. We have no idea where they were. Have no idea at all. We don't know. Some say Mesoamerica. Some say Middle America. Some say North America. Who knows? Some say South America. We can't find it. Could it be mythical? It very well could. Just like Middle Earth is mythical. And yet it's real. Even if Joseph Smith himself created the Book of Mormon, his vivid and dramatic imagination was real. And I know Dan Vogel, my dear friend, is in the audience tonight, and I do side with him on the pious fraud that he shared with us in his magnificent book, Charisma, which I do hope you're all reading. You should be. You're cheating yourselves if you don't, because his pious fraud idea, if something turns you to the good, and doesn't matter, take your pick, moral good, intellectual good, spiritual good, physical good, whatever kind of good, if something turns you to the good, then from Joseph Smith's point of view, according to Dan Vogel, then it's justified in using deception to get someone to do the good who wouldn't do the good if you simply told them the truth. The truth would be more harmful than the false. I hope I've stated that correctly. Dan Vogel, you're in the audience. If I did misstate your premise, I apologize. Please do feel free to correct me in the notes or in the sidebar here in the chat. So on this historical Jesus, we have a land that we can visit. But what about the person? Now, we're all, I think, at least I hope most of us by now, we're all familiar with the incredible, stimulating, now that doesn't mean it's true or false. I use stimulating on purpose because the way Richard Carrier on the historicity of Jesus, why we might have reason to doubt, the basis that he has postulated in this text, that Jesus only has a 33% chance of having been a historical figure, and I have read in other later discussions and writings from Carrier himself that he says, look, 33% from my point of view is really actually still a pretty good, it's 1 in 3. That's not bad for someone whom we have so little information about, given the enormous importance that is applied to the historical Jesus. He is hated in some circles. He is loved in other circles. He is argued in all circles. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. Not Richard Carrier's point of view tonight. I have had him on this channel with my dear friend Derek Lambert. I had him on for about an hour, and that was over a year ago. We talked a little bit about the historical Jesus. And I hear he's going to try to do a second volume, or at least an updating of this one, where he does address, I hope he does an exhaustive study on his criticisms. I have a very good friend online goes by the handle of Kishkumen, that I'm going to explore some of his materials. I have lots of good friends online. I mean, look at you. There's 56, there's 65 of you in here right now. I love all of you. You're awesome. But Kishkumen and Manetho and Ipsressa and Drumdude and most of all, Dastardly Stem have been, and I've jumped in some of these discussions with them on this historical Jesus issue. Dastardly Stem is the one that keeps presenting new posts, and he attracts several scholars. He attracts atheists. He attracts Christians. Huckleberry is another very good one. Gadianton has posted on it a bit. But tonight I want to focus more or less on Kishkumen and his themes. The way he approaches this historical Jesus material is so fascinating to me, because I'll confess, when I first read Carrier, one of the reasons that I picked up Carrier in the first place was because I was going through my faith crisis. And mine was kind of a long, drawn-out affair. And in the process, I thought, well, let's get straight to the core. What I did is I went atheist. At least that's what I say. I felt I did at the time. I bought plenty of their books and read plenty of their books. But I thought, well, what about Jesus? Which in my mind is a perfectly legitimate, logical approach to exploring the faith crisis from an organized religion that does propound a real Jesus. And I swallowed him hook, line, and sinker. And I do not mean that in a negative fashion. I'm just saying Carrier at that time was so overwhelmingly, obviously correct and powerful in my mind that I bandied him about on the internet for quite a while. And then as I began to read other reviews, as I began to talk to my friends online, as I began to argue pro and con, I saw the value of their approach. Now, Kishkumen is a professional historian down in Florida. He does teach Roman history in the era of the early Christians' time, which is probably the most important, famous, wonderful, fun stuff to read other than the fall of the Roman Empire. And for that, you can get Gibbon. Even though he is dated, there's other updates from him since. But and I want to share some of the ideas and themes that Kishkumen responds to. I'm going to do a hop, skip, and a jump. I am not trying to skip over anyone. There is enough material here that I could do 400 of these podcasts, sincerely. And I very well may, because the topic is just so awesome. So here we go. I want to share this first idea from Kishkumen. And Dastardly Stem and Kishkumen are friends, and yet they butt heads a lot. And this is one of the enjoyable things about these types of discussions. We're all friends on this message boards. We really seriously certainly do not all think alike, and we absolutely do not all agree. I have had arguments with Kishkumen myself, and I've gotten my butt whopped, so I'm very careful. He's so well read. And so, and there's give and take, and it's fun, but we are in the process of exploring. Here is how Kishkumen basically responds, and then I'm going to hop, skip, and jump through to several of his posts, and I will try to contextualize them through reading some of the previous portions that he has highlighted, because I have become persuaded by his view and approach to Jesus more so. Nothing's absolute in ancient history, folks. Let's just get real for a little bit. You're never going to get to certainty. No historian of antiquity is out for certainty. Let's just put that on the table. We're not after certainty. So what puzzles me here is why it should matter. whether a Jesus, son of Mary and Joseph, lived or not, such that it becomes the focus of dubious arguments of granular probabilities. So the reason Kishkumen is saying this is, in ancient history, we have methodologies that we have to use if we want to try to find the most probable truth, maybe the most probable, the best understanding of what happened, simply because the evidence, let's face it, it sucks, but it's true. The evidence just isn't there for us to thoroughly get a full grasp. We're winging it in many instances. We are most definitely interpreting it without question. Those interpretations, one of my eye-opening realizations occurred to me concerning what I was calling having a testimony when I was a Mormon, in that given what we're told about the Holy Ghost, and I've said this in many of my videos, and I'm sticking with it until I see something better. And this is unfortunate. I'm not crowing about it. I wish it was different, but it's not. Given the nature of what is propounded to be the doctrine of the Holy Ghost, there can be no possibility of this, what can we call it, an eternal spirit who, according to some LDS leaders and apostles and prophets, will eventually gain a physical body, and yet as such, as a spirit, he is fully God. So see, it doesn't take a body to become a God. You can point to the Holy Ghost. That's one of the many contradictions in the Mormon theology, this Godhead subject. Not the subject I'm going to talk about, but given what we're told about the Holy Ghost, he will bring to your mind a remembrance of all things. He will teach you the truth in our human, finite, very limited, both in space and time and intellect. There is no way that an interpretation of Jesus can be the truth. And the Holy Ghost is not going to testify to us that what we say about Jesus, and I mean, you can bring in all four of the Gospels, you can bring in the writings of Paul and James and John, all of them, Peter in the New Testament. You can bring in the whole Old Testament, even though Jesus isn't even a twinkle in his mama's eye, and there is no mention of him there. Yes, I'm well aware of the proposed messianic prophecies of Jesus in the Old Testament, none of which have held up to scrutiny so far as I have been able to tell. Not that I'm the expert. I am not trying to say I am. But man, I've read some experts, and Jesus is nowhere to be thought of. That is all an interpretation read back into and back onto the Old Testament. So understanding that core theme, is it any wonder, because of our limited sources and our limited resources, that there are so many different Jesuses? And when I say that, now, historically, of course, there's more than one person that was named Jesus. That is not at all what I'm alluding to here. What I am saying is the various religious interpretations of Jesus, even the non-Christian ones, are just that. They are interpretations. We're never going to get away from that. But they are not the truth. And that is not to disparage anyone's interpretation. That is not my theme here tonight, not at all. But let's get that part straight. So this was part of the faith crisis that I went through, and periodically it does stab me again, and it kind of makes me flinch, you know. So here is how Kishkumen put it. These dubious arguments of detailed probabilities, he poetically calls them granular probabilities. I like how he put that. So Kishkumen says, well, he appeared to have lived, but that is not the important question. Now, let's understand this. If you stopped right there and said, see, Kishkumen is clueless without reading the full context, then you're an idiot, because he does give his full context. Here's his point. He appears to have lived, but that is not the important question. The important question is whether he was resurrected or not. You simply can't prove it any more than you can prove that the Emperor Vespasian really did heal 2 sick Alexandrians in 69 of the Common Era. All we can say, because of the nature of the evidence and of what sources we have that just happened to have survived from antiquity, is that these historical individuals were credited with miracles. Much more is known about Vespasian. So there is much more evidence of his life. Are you any more confident that he healed these people then, because historically the evidence demonstrates that he was a real person? I'm not convinced that that proves he healed these people. And I thought, okay, well, now there's, from the professional historian point of view, that's probably just about as firm and solid as we're going to get. Notice how careful and yet rational he is trying to be, and I really have always appreciated that in him. Gentleman going by failed prophecy says perhaps that's the point of the entire exercise, to avoid the important question altogether. If one gives an unreasonable answer to the former question, the latter question becomes easy to answer. And now Kishkumen says, okay, above all, I believe that the principal goal ought to be making people better thinkers, not strategizing to win at all costs. And thus we see the fallibility of organized religion, meaning church religions. And you know exactly what I mean. Don't play coy or stupid with me. Catholicism, Mormonism, Methodism, Lutheranism, Episcopalian, Seventh-day Adventist, Jehovah's Witness, etc., etc. The organized religions. So I was not impressed with Richard Carrier's arguments because they lacked sensitivity to narrative and genre. Now, this is why it is so useful and important for me now, trying to attempt to become a fiction writer in which I can share very interesting truths through fiction, to study J.R.R. Tolkien, because literature and genre are critical as are narrative. It was as though Richard Carrier treated the Gospels like 20th century history textbooks. This can be seriously and is seriously problematic. To the professional historian of antiquity, that does not work. So he would subjectively judge that a sequence of events was plausible or not, and conclude that no historical person would have experienced events in that way. I did not see his method really helping his readers understanding the text on its own terms any better. We are better served learning about the thought world of antiquity to grapple with interpreting antiquity's texts, rather than simply asking whether something is likely to have happened or not. Interesting point, from my opinion. I'll walk you through Suetonius's biography of Augustus and point out lots of things that probably did not happen as reported in the historical record, but that has no bearing whatsoever on whether he existed or not. We know he did. Very salient point in this particular type of historical investigative question concerning ancient historical persons and their reality. And I think for the most part, Kishkumen, from my point of view, at this point in my journey, I think he's got the upper hand. And that's one reason why I want to jump into this a little bit. And someone else has said to Kishkumen, well said, thank you for articulating this. McJathan did. And so now the way Dastardly Stem responds here to Kishkumen is interesting, and I'll give him credit where credit's due. Dastardly Stem is the gentleman who keeps carrying on these various wonderful threads on this historical Jesus, and to him goes full credit, man. We really appreciate it. It's wonderful to think through all this stuff. When Kishkumen says, what puzzles me here is why it should matter whether a Jesus, son of Mary and Joseph, lived or not. Similar here, according to Dastardly Stem. Why should it matter if Moses, Adam, King Arthur, or another figure really lived or were based on someone else who did? It's a question for history at the very least, and that may matter in some realm. And then Kishkumen says, such that it becomes the focus of dubious arguments of granular probabilities. If dubious could be demonstrated, then so be it. And then Kishkumen says he appears to have lived, but that is not the important question. And Dastardly Stem says, well, that's a matter of perspective, I suppose. Something important to one is not so much to another. Kind of interesting there. Makes sense. Kish said the important question is whether he was resurrected or not. And Dastardly Stem responds to that with, well, why is that important? As if more so than other questions in history. I think he's trying to play a little coy here. Sincerely, I do. It should be obvious. If Jesus never existed, then the resurrection, like previously storied resurrection of whatever sort, isn't all that interesting other than a tale within a myth. And here, from my meager study of mythology, I would completely disagree with Dastardly Stem. I don't think he has a clue what myth is or what its function is or what it actually does do for us. Tolkien isn't myth, and yet it is. And I know I'm going to get slapped by the Tolkien experts for saying that. We know it's not actual history, but history is not the only basis for truth. Mythology, fiction, fantasy, etc. Imagination always comes first. Look at any invention out there in the world. It was thought. It was pictured in the mind first, then transferred to physical reality. What we, here we go. Hey, don't tell me I didn't warn you. Oh, wait, I didn't warn you. Anything physical is based on our human size as we are in our bodies this way, right? I'm 6 foot, for instance. I'm way too heavy, so I'm not going to tell you my weight, but my IQ is too low. I'm not going to tell you that either. But it is the manner of how our brains, along with our eyeballs and our nerves, etc., interact with the world and how we interpret the vibrations of the atoms and the molecules, etc., that we then call that physical. An interpretation, right? So anyway, I'm off on a tangent now. But that's the case even if Mark's story, now Mark, Dastardly Stem really goes to the Gospel of Mark, and I'm quite certain it is based on Richard Carrier's analysis of the Gospel of Mark. I have been studying the Gospel of Mark through James Tabor's Gospel of Mark course and analyzing it with other biblical students. And it's a very interesting study, to be sure, but The case, even if Mark's story had some person who had lived in mind, Mark is being very mimetic in his approach, at least according to MacDonald. Dennis R. MacDonald, another fantastic New Testament and classics author. I have had him on my channel a few times, and I will try to get him on again some more. So the question, did Jesus really resurrect, may not, depending on the perspective you take, be all that important at all. It is merely part of the mythologizing. Kind of an interesting stance. But if he understood the way mythology presents us with a reality that points to the transcendent instead of to the physical, then he would see, I would hope, he would see his mistake he's making. So a mere part of mythologizing. Mythologizing gives the whole context of the whole, which cannot be physically explained or described. But that doesn't make the whole not real. I'll leave it at that. So much for philosophy, right? Hang on, I got to get a drink. I'm going to do a lot of talking tonight. And Kishkumen very properly says you simply can't prove it any more than you can prove that the Emperor Vespasian really did heal 2 sick Alexandrians in 69 of the Common Era. Stem agrees. He says that's right. And not being able to validate claimed miracles in history is the very reason why it's more likely they are simply tales. Stem is just being stupid here. No offense, Stem, but that's the dumbest logic I've ever seen. Because historically, yeah, never mind. We ought to keep clear, he says, the question of one claim, a miracle story, and another, like whether a certain character written about lives are 2 separate questions. Neither is more important than the other. They're simply different. I would disagree. He's trying to make all claims on the same level. That would make hash of anything we value, in my opinion. And again, I'm not trying to pick on Dastardly Stem. I'm not trying to even take sides, honestly. I'm just looking at the discussion. So Kish says, all we can say is that these historical individuals were credited with miracles. But Stem comes back and says, oh no, we can say much more than that. That's the impetus behind all the writing that continues to this day and behind the whole discipline of study that will no doubt continue beyond our day. This is interesting stuff, not just because it's history, I grant, but also because so many believe with certainty so many things that seem unlikely. Yeah, all right. I get that. Kish says much more is known about Vespasian. There is much more evidence of his life. Are you any more confident that he healed these people? I'm not. Stem says, nope, that's just a different question. And I think we can be happy that there is much more that can be said about Vespasian and Jesus. And it's nice we can enjoy the fruits of scholarly endeavors. See, I really like Dastardly Stem. I really do. Now, this is interesting, because Dastardly Stem then says, Kishkumen and then failed prophecy. Kish said he appears to have lived, but that's not the important question. The important question is whether he was resurrected or not. And failed prophecy said, yeah, that gives us a chance to ignore the proper question. Stem says, what I find silly about this approach is any person can grant, say, the historicity of Jesus for the sake of seriously taking a look at the question of whether Jesus resurrected. These are simply 2 separate questions. You can approach them each with the same degree of importance if you like, or you can separate them just like Kishkumen did as well. So here's what Kish says. He's responding to another comment of Dastardly Stem, who said, not sure what you mean by this because I experienced it differently. He treated the Gospels as they were first century texts. He's talking about Richard Carrier. He claims Carrier treated the Gospels as they were first century texts, as I saw it, but that's not really the point of this thread. Kishkumen says, well, neither Symmachus nor I agree that he does, and both Symmachus and I have been trained to be professionals at reading such texts. Symmachus is another very fabulously well-informed scholar of antiquity, classical antiquity, and he posts periodically every now and then, and I really wish he'd post more. He is sensational. Carrier proposes a new way of reading these texts that tosses aside a lot of what distinguishes them as first century texts in the way that he approaches them. I've seen it in action. I think it is bad methodology. In the study of history, and it really doesn't matter whether you're studying World War II, World War I, wouldn't matter if you're studying the Crimean War, the history of Russia, King Arthur. It wouldn't matter if you're studying the history of Iceland or the Old Testament. It doesn't matter. Methodology is critical in the study of history. With a bad methodology, you truly do get the wrong results. And I grant, I understand. That is what Carrier says the historians of the historical Jesus themselves are guilty of. That's part of the argument. And I don't think it's been settled yet, but we're discussing it. And that's the important key. We're keeping this door open so that we can continue to analyze, test, retest, see what fits, see what doesn't. And that's what I love about Kishkumen, is he brings that to the table and he never lets it get slid off the table. So, and Kishkumen says, I disagree with this approach. I think we can do both. Did this really happen is a big part of the equation. And no doubt there is far more to it than that. And I think getting walked through Suetonius' biography would be interesting. I'd be up for it. I would too, but Kishkumen, I don't think this ever really came through. Kish has brought a little bit out. And I started reading Suetonius so that I could get prepared for Kish. I'm not faulting Kish. I'm just saying, life gets in the way of having fun studying antiquity, right? So Kishkumen says, well, ancient historians are rhetoricians first, then dealers in facts. And oh my gosh, there's a boatload of evidence for this. He's exactly right. The rhetoric is usually the primary point. I mean, if you've ever read Cicero, you'd see it. Something may have happened, but how it was reported may twist it out of all recognition. Indeed, we know, and I have several of them back here somewhere. Oh, the texts. Hold on, I'll grab them real quick. This is really kind of a good illustration. We know of these four major classics that I've been able to collect through the years. I haven't gotten through them all the way yet, but the landmark Xenophon's Anabasis, excellent edition. This is the landmark Julius Caesar, the complete works of Julius Caesar, the landmark Herodotus, excellent text, and the landmark Thucydides, a comprehensive guide to the Peloponnesian War. Well, we know every one of these were reporting in the way they report things. That doesn't mean that's how they actually happened. I'll keep it simple for you. That's basically what we have. And these are the real fathers of the ancient history in the ancient times. And now through other various sources, we're able to check and cross-check. We now know absolutely all authors of any stripe never could just simply record what happened. That's not what ancient history is about. That's not what history is about. Go to any bookstore, go to the shelf on World War II, and just try to count the number of books that have been written on that war in under an hour. You think I'm bluffing? Go right ahead and take my challenge. Every one of those books are an interpretation, and not all of them agree. In fact, I would dare say 99% of them do not agree in all the particulars, because we interpret the history. We are interpreting that Jesus never really existed if you're a mythicist, and we are interpreting that Jesus did exist as a historical person if you're a historian, right? Who he was is the interpretation. And in point of fact, what he did is also an interpretation, right? Because as Dennis MacDonald has shown in some of his fabulous books, the Dionysian Gospel and the shipwrecked Gospels, and does the New Testament imitate Homer, and Luke and Virgil, and mythologizing Jesus, and the Homeric epics in the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospels in Homer. All of these show that there were accretions of other literatures that were put together in order to form a story, not because it happened, but in order to teach a truth. This is what fiction does so well. All you have to do is read Tolkien. He's the master at it. Read my book when I get it finished. I'll let you know as well. And my daughter's, Katie Cross, a selfless, shameless plug. Yes, that's true. But at the same time, we also know, thanks to the works of Thomas Brodie, one of the powerhouse texts, the birthing of the New Testament, that not only did the writers utilize texts that they had access to in order to create their stories, in order to enhance and elevate the already existing historical Jesus, but they had to, because that's what the original Old Testament authors were doing too. Not only is it based on the Greeks, but it is fundamentally based on the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. There's no question they took the Elijah-Elisha narrative seriously and basically force fit for a spiritual theme the entire life of Jesus within that narrative. And that was a huge deal. That was a very important thing for the gospel authors to do, most especially the Gospel of Mark. And the Millers, in their text, shows that very, very well. The Gospel of Mark as midrash on earlier Jewish and New Testament literature. Dale Miller and Patricia Miller. That's a sensational book. Very interesting. So Kishkumen is right. The ancient historians are rhetoricians first. Then they deal with the facts. So the rhetoric is usually the primary point. Something may have happened, but how it was reported may disguise what happened completely out of recognition. We won't even understand it the same way. So it may appear more credible than it was, or it may not have happened. And this is exactly the point of why great care must be exercised in dealing with these texts. In antiquity, we ought to, if we're attempting to try to see what happened and what they actually thought and believed, then we have to take them seriously in their context. That's the point. Knowing the tropes and rhetorical tendencies is paramount. If one asks in a vacuum, is this plausible, without any real consideration of the rhetoric and tropes, then the results of the did it happen investigation may be a hash. And that is a dig, it is a criticism of Richard Carrier, because according to Kishkumen, this is what it looks like Richard Carrier did. Dastardly Stem disagrees with this, and they go back and forth on this. I'm not going to read it all to you, but they go back and forth. And in the process, Kishkumen makes some good points that I want to share with you, that I think are worth going through. So, and Dastardly Stem asks Kish a question. He says, why is the resurrection important, as if more so than other questions in history? If Jesus never existed, then the resurrection, like previously storied resurrections of whatever sort, isn't all that interesting, other than a tale within a myth. And if it's the case in Mark's story that he had some person who had lived in his mind, Mark is very mimetic in his approach, at least according to MacDonald. So the question, did Jesus really resurrect or not, depending on the perspective, may be all that important after all. It may not be. It's merely part of the mythologizing. Here's Kishkumen's response. Excuse me while I chew my ice for just a minute. Oh, hey. Hi, Geoplanet Jane. Hey, Radio Free Mormon. How you doing? Oh, Trevor Luke, there you are. I hope I'm not mashing up your discussion too bad. So here is what Kishkumen said. Because his life is not what makes him matter to Christians. Now, if I was to stop right there, you would think this guy is an atheist. He's not an atheist. So let's get the full context. Because his life is not what makes him matter to Christians. His resurrection is what makes him matter to Christians. So presumably we're on a forum for discussing Mormonism, where the critical question of the resurrection is the point. Atheists pay Richard Carrier to say Jesus may not have lived, and so his resurrection is even less likely to have happened. I think that's a backward strategy, unlikely to do much more than stoke shortcut thinking among atheists who find it exciting. So Kishkumen is not buying the mythicist approach. To the contrary, Jesus, like other people of his age, was credited with miracles. Some of these other people are just as poorly attested, or more poorly, than Jesus is, and others are much better documented. So the miracle stories are not the criteria that makes them more or less likely to have lived. It's a very important point. The evidence for their lives is. Honi the circle drawer is less well attested than Jesus. Very few people question his existence. Motivated reasoning is what makes people question the existence of Jesus, according to Kishkumen. I think, all right, well, that's very interesting indeed. And in fact, I even said that in my own post. I said that, yeah, that's very interesting. And so let me skip diddy-doo-dah for just a moment. And they're talking about people are getting really kind of nasty to each other. And we do that periodically. Yeah, everybody's emotionally invested one way or another in this particularly fascinating subject. So, I mean, you can't yell at us for that. Everybody is. So. But they got through all of that. And sure enough, as sugar is sweet, we get to the point that, hold on. I've got another couple ideas now. Okay. Oh, he's trying to get Dastardly Stem to tell what he thinks on the specifics of Suetonius's account of Tiberius's activities on Capri. And I went ahead and read that last week and studied through it, and I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Kishkumen always gives us excellent historical points in that regard. Let me keep, okay, so, and here's one of his other ones where this is really a good, this is what caused me to read Suetonius's account. It's in his book, The 12 Caesars. It's up here somewhere. Anyway, it's in Tiberius. It's in his book, The 12 Caesars. So Stem says it's probably been 3 weeks ago now, and I've read too many other things to remember exactly as I read it. I recall how vividly different it was from the gospel accounts, which is irrelevant to historicity. It felt more alive. Yeah, that's completely subjective, if you will, to me. And that's okay. I'm not saying that makes him wrong. I'm just saying that's not a criteria for anything, really. But I'd have to get back to it when I have a chance. I'm eager to go over Dennis MacDonald's newest work, and I do believe he's talking about this one right here, Synopsis of Epic Tragedy in the Gospels, and I would highly recommend this also. Dennis R. MacDonald, and it's not expensive. It's one of his least expensive books, and it's a total overview of his entire life's works. It is really exceptionally excellent. So, Kishkumen says, that's cool. Stylistically, it is quite different from the Gospels. Now he's talking about Suetonius's account of Tiberius on Capri. Yes, the style is different from the Gospels, of course. Where our discussion gets hung up, in my opinion, is in the implicit demand people like Richard Carrier make that ancient texts have to conform to modern ideas about fact and truth. That is worth thinking on. One of the huge no-nos in my history class when I was studying the history of Russia as well as American history way back when, in the 1990s, was we cannot logistically or legitimately read our view today onto someone like Peter the Great or Catherine the Great in Russia, and they were only, 300 or 400 years ago. We're not talking ancient history. We're just talking just a few hundred years back, but we are never justified in taking our mores, our values, our rhetorical tropes, and our understanding of reality and read it back onto them in order to compare to them whether they knew about reality or not, or whether they were right or wrong, or whether something happened, or whether someone existed. This is really the linchpin. This is the key to Kishkumen's approach to all of antiquity, and I am with him 100%. These ideas come out of certain developments in intellectual history that really do not pertain to ancient literature. Right on. Exactly. That's why we cannot justifiably read the Mormon temple endowment into the Jerusalem temple of Jesus's day, or even more stupidly ridiculous, into King Solomon's ancient Jewish temple back in David's day, 900 BC. It can't, nor should it be done. To do so is an absolute mockery and travesty, and is just not going to gain you any truth or wisdom. And yet that's what Mormons insist. Oh, this was a restoration of what was had earlier in Jesus's day, all of our temple endowment. We absolutely know that's not the case. I mean, I've had Cheryl Bruno and Nick Latursky on my channel a few times talking about their book on Freemasonry. I've had Dan Vogel on. I've had lots of Mormon historians and people on. I've had Charlie Harrell on talking about this subject over and over again. You can't do it that way and be valid. You're never justified in doing so. You're interpreting, and that's fine. Don't turn around and tell me that my eternal salvation depends on believing your obviously phony interpretation. That's bunk. The Holy Ghost is not going to. If the Holy Ghost tells you that, yes, they were doing baptisms for the dead and being married for time and all eternity in the Jerusalem temple, you can pretty much take it to the bank, not the Kirtland Bank, of course, but you can take it to not Zion's Bank today either. Boy, they're just about as bad. That it's pure baloney. So this is really important. Everything written in the ancient world must be judged according to the thought world of the ancient world in time and from that culture. Folks, the ancient Jewish culture in Jerusalem in Jesus's day was not wearing a white shirt and tie to sacrament meeting in order for you to be spiritual enough to get a witness from the Holy Ghost. That kind of dumb bullshit is what is taught, and it's completely phony. You get the point. Tiberius lived on Capri, and many Romans resented his absence because the emperor was expected to be present in the city for the Romans. His absence resulted in chaos in the Senate and his unavailability to the people of the city at entertainments and things like that. His neglect was attributed to his own excessive desire for personal pleasures, which are blown up to mythological proportions. Petronius's Satyricon gives us a sense of where this kind of satirical fantasy comes from. You see, we can use comparative literature to see how they are handling it back then, is the idea. We have controls on this. It is a fictional novel, but the spirit of it is not unlike the grotesque scenes in Suetonius's account of Tiberius on Capri. If the rumors about Tiberius were made up or fashioned to conform to models local to the Bay of Naples or in Campania, it may be that they were not even real rumors, or the rumors themselves were consciously formed in order to meet certain tastes and expectations back then. For these reasons, although it is true that Tiberius historically did live on Capri for much of the final decade of his life, according to the historical record I read in Suetonius, in the print edition I have, we cannot be certain from the outlandish descriptions of his actions are true. And this is critical. When we're looking at the ancient historical information, we have to be aware and we have to work within the limitations of our limitations. You can't just extravagantly start saying what is true and what is false based on what you like and what you hope is true or false, because it aligns with your personal values. And yet, we see that that's pretty much the essence of all organized religions with Jesus, can't we? Kind of interesting. Edward Champlin, and this guy is good. I looked him up. Edward Champlin has written about the twisting of folklore about the wise king of the island to make Tiberius look bad in Suetonius's account. And there could be political motivations, there could be religious motivations, there could be sexual motivations, there could be jealousies. Who knows what the motivations were? But things were not always just recorded as they happened. In fact, the majority of ancient history is never written that way from then, because their whole, what's the best way to put this? Their whole moral approach, their whole intellectual apparatus with which they functioned in order to arrive at the truth was not our view of history. We want to know what happened. We have many instances of what was written is what someone thought should have happened, or what was said in a speech was written by what they think should have been said for that occasion instead of what was said. But we don't have what was said. All we have is what they recorded, and it is these that have survived to come down to our day. But don't tell me that's truth and reality. That's an interpretation. See the point? It's a very important point. So Kishkumen is doing an excellent job here. Champlin has thus shown why it is we have to be extremely careful when we read Suetonius on this subject. We may want to believe a story was factual, that Tiberius really did have a fisherman's face rubbed raw because he stepped onto a part of Capri that he was forbidden to visit. But then the knowledge that the presentation of a fish to the tyrant or king was a commonplace, well, this raises important questions about the actual facts. So the line between fact and fiction isn't exactly where we might expect it to be. That's the issue. Tiberius lived. That line is firm. We don't even have to ever ask the question. But how people felt about his memory profoundly shaped his historical image. And I'm here to tell you, there were some people back then, as you read Suetonius, that really liked him, and there were a lot of people that absolutely hated his guts. Who got to write about him? But more importantly, whose writings survived for us to read? And is that the only materials that were written, and are those actual, accurate historical memoirs? We don't know. But that doesn't mean Tiberius was just invented. This is Kishkumen's very powerful point about a historical man named Jesus. By the way, I know there might be some who really argue, and if you want to, that's fine. I'll take it up I'll actually do a video on it if you think I'm kidding. But Jesus Christ was not his name. Just so you understand. All right. Just, there we have it. So, it looks like Kishkumen is here. Awesome. Very good. Very good. So that's some of the ideas from my friend Kishkumen. I get to call him friend so he can hear me say it. Woohoo! Of course, and we have wonderful phone conversations all the time. So he knows that I consider him a very dear friend, very smart, very knowledgeable, fun. I always learn from him. That's one reason why I really do like him. So, and anyway, let me skip through this. This is just me. Yeah, here's where I said, now, yeah, I read it in Suetonius, 12 Caesars. And then I found a Historum forum on Tiberius, and it's the entire issue of Suetonius on Tiberius at Capri, and it's a scholarly discussion among antiquarians and classical scholars discussing just these issues that I've been talking about and why they're relevant when we shift from the person of Tiberius to the person of Jesus. There really is a powerful analogy here. So, and that's important to keep in mind. And let me see. Okay, and here's something else. Someone said that there was a different Tiberius that they were thinking of, and then someone brought up Apollonius of Tyana and his comparisons with the historical Jesus. And Kishkumen says the Apollonius example is a fruitful choice. Let me read. Oh yeah, this is my good friend Huckleberry, who is also, Huckleberry is an exquisitely knowledgeable Christian. When I was tangling with him when I was going full on atheist mode, man, he would kick me across the room quite a few times. He's pretty knowledgeable. You can't pull the wool over his eyes. He said Apollonius of Tyana's name stems from where he was born, Tyana, and this was in Cappadocia, so in modern Turkey. Seems like all these important people were born in modern Turkey, back then called Cappadocia. So it's said that he also traveled to Greece and Syria, and Jesus Christ traveled the Middle East. So there are also claims that Jesus went to India during the years of his life, for which the Bible does not record his youth, and therefore there is a chance that the two crossed paths and competed with one another for followers. Bayesian probability, I would put that maybe at 5, just not likely at all. Who knows? The article starts with 2 pictures, one of Jesus, the other of Apollonius. It's surprising how much they resemble each other artistically, though I might note that the style of painting appears to be 1,000 years after Jesus and Apollonius lived, so of course. So the Apollonius example is a fruitful choice, according to Kishkumen. To it, I would add Alexander of Abanutikos. I'm probably mashing the Greek. Sorry. He'll correct you in the chat there. Lucian wrote about Alexander before Philostratus did his writing on Apollonius. Although Apollonius was alive in the late 1st century and early 2nd century BC, I think the earliest biography of Apollonius, which Philostratus relied upon, was an early 2nd century biography. So, in other words, when you see these parallels occurring between various different ancient historical figures and Jesus, and in this instance, we're talking about Apollonius. Kishkumen makes a good point here. The stories of Apollonius and Alexander were written in the era when Christianity was really taking shape. So the, quote, heretics, unquote, of the Alexander story are Epicureans and Christians. Keep this in mind. Both groups pose a threat to the traditional Hellenic paganism. The Epicureans because they deny the involvement of the divine in our world, and the Christians because they identify their traditional gods as evil demons. So from that perspective, they're heretics. Isn't that fascinating? So the latter teaching is a particular sore point to me. What does it say about a religion that it literally demonizes the traditional practices and beliefs of the society in which it grows up? You've got a point here. Surely here is a monstrous form of intolerance. At any rate, both Apollonius and Alexander are examples of the high imperial holy man. Now, this again is a very interesting theme in antiquity, in the Mediterranean antiquity of Jesus's day. Of course, there's no such thing in our day. All we have is the dipshit politicians and the dingling so-called prophets, and none of them are doing us any good right now. But the high imperial holy man from antiquity, the characters in the tradition of Epimenides and Pythagoras, whom Jesus eventually supersedes. I don't think that there's a lot of space between them and Jesus, including the way in which they are talked about. So what makes Jesus distinctive is that he comes out of a predominantly, not an exclusively, but a predominantly Jewish environment. And so he cannot interact extensively with the gods and the structures of Hellenism. That was what Paul did. Kishkumen doesn't say that. That's what I'm saying. And yet, Jesus still manages to come very close, which is not surprising given to the extent which the Palestine of his era was very well Hellenized. So here again, we see that historical context means an awful lot if we are to attempt to be more probably accurate than more probably mistaken, but we'll never arrive at certainty. So that's the way this works. So, and then we go on here. Then Kishkumen and I have a couple of very nice words in exchange. And then Huckleberry comes along and he tells me I'm being too general, which I was, and I plead guilty, Huck. And we kind of talked about it a little bit here. It's nothing that's very interesting, not as much as Kishkumen's ideas. Okay, so another good friend of mine, Res Ipsa, said, the lack of an objective standard should be a red flag that leads one to be highly skeptical of the method. Whatever differences there are in intent between Hugh Nibley and Dennis MacDonald are irrelevant if the method is flawed, and it is. They're talking about parallelisms. And yet, for all of that, without parallels, we can't do history. So the idea of parallelism itself is not a flawed methodology, I don't think. I'm willing to be corrected if it can be demonstrated, but you got to have it. It's just that most people overzealously misuse it. So to understand the relationship, if any, between any two things requires careful consideration of both the similarities and the differences. That's parallels and not parallels, right? Together with the reasoned analysis of which similarities and which differences matter. That is how I suggest an educated person would approach this issue. So, in other words, this destroys Mormon apologists because they're not willing to do it this way at all, right? So here's Kishkumen's wisdom on this. He says, he asks a pertinent question here. Is it desirable to have an objective standard for meaning making? So I agree with you that comparison requires careful consideration of similarities and differences. But what is the point of the exercise? We probably got Nibley's point wrong, but then we should have done a better job of explaining what it is he was up to. MacDonald's method is fine. Dennis R. MacDonald, he's talked about. And both Kishkumen and I are good friends with Dennis R. MacDonald. We've talked to him, and yeah, his method is fine. He's saying this as a professional historian. Finding Greek parallels from the Greek literature and stories within the New Testament Gospels. That is not an invalid method. But then he should have done a better. MacDonald's method is fine. I look at what he is doing as opening up our understanding of the possibilities. In other words, how the Gospels were composed and interpreted. Since for us, it is impossible to read the minds of authors and readers, but it is possible to peek into the thought world that informed those compositions of the Gospels and the Homeric epics and Euripides and the Greek classics. We can look at that thought world that informed those compositions and interpretations, and we can therefore, through a comparative literary analysis, we can make a reasonable stab at what might be going on. This is how history is done. Short of mind reading, that's probably as much as we can do. Thank goodness we can do that. Right on, Kish. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, and Res Ipsa says, I'm skeptical of objectively making meaning. And I am too. I think that's probably about right. Now, Kishkumen says, oh, well, let me read the whole thought, Res Ipsa. I don't know about desirability, but I'm skeptical at the notion of objectively making meaning. If the exercise in this case is to try and understand how Justin Martyr and his contemporaries thought about the Gospels, fully recognizing our limitations, I have no quarrel. Giving the parallels asserted by Justin evidentiary value on the question of Jesus' existence is where my quarrel lies. And so Kiss says, well, it may be that Nibley and MacDonald were engaged in fundamentally different projects. Now, Kishkumen knew Hugh Nibley. He was there at BYU while Nibley was there. If I remember right, he took a class or two from him. He didn't read as much of Nibley's works as I have, though, but he has the better claim to authority on things Nibley. So with Nibley, I don't think it's possible to say that his LDS work was straight history. I would agree. I would argue that he was engaged in meaning making, and how Nibley did his meaning making was by relating Mormonism to the ancient world. Apologetics. I come on, there's no other word. Give me any other word I can use, right? So Mormonism became the lens that Hugh Nibley used for interpreting antiquity, and the Farms people adopted the same strategy. So it is unfortunate that people are not made aware of the difference. MacDonald, Dennis R. MacDonald, is fundamentally a historian, and he uses historical and philological methods to the best of his ability to help us understand how the New Testament literature was pitched at people who were conversant in classical literature. So that is very interesting. I like that. So, and then they're talking a little more about dastardly stem. And Justin a little bit. Okay. Oh, and this is another important, and this is why I wanted to make this the night for Kishkumen, simply because this is such an important concept. No, I don't. He's saying I have a lot of authority, or else he's telling one of you guys that. I haven't been paying attention to your chat because I'm on another screen sharing us Kishkumen's excellent ideas. So now, I wonder, and now this is someone else talking about dastardly stem. He says, I wonder, but I could be wrong, that Stem sees enough wrong with Christianity that he wishes a complete reboot, dismissing all the past assumptions. That's actually a fair point. A reboot could present a hope for escape from the entanglements of past conflict and oppression, but all that's going to do realistically, that won't solve the problem, because we are so far away from that issue, 2,000 years, both in time and space. We're here in the United States. You know, the land Israel doesn't mean anything near to us what it does to the Jews, both anciently and today. So, I mean, even that is a vast difference. So it would just be us reinterpreting it yet again over from our now modern scientific perspective, which wouldn't give us any more truth or meaning, I would think. That's just my interpretation. I don't think it's hard to understand a wish to escape the past understanding of things. There is hope that things do not have to be as they were in the past. The future is new. Actually, the future is non-existent. Only the now exists, but that's getting philosophical on you. So here's what Kishkumen says. He says, Stem feels strongly that our assumptions must be challenged. And I'm in agreement with that. And so is Kish. The question is, what degree of skepticism is warranted? And this gets sticky, to say the least. In the end, I think extreme skepticism may prove more useful in some areas than others. In religious history, it is a lot more useful than in politics and science. I don't know, though. Hold on, Kish. I may have to disagree with you. Skepticism in science is really, really important until you've got enough evidence to assent to the likelihood. Well, I mean, the same thing's true in history, though. So the question Kish asks, what are the stakes in religious history? Will people en masse lose their religion because of mythicism? Hardly. And I can agree with him. So bring it on, I say. It's good to see just how tenuous historical knowledge of past eras is. Now, understand his premise here. This is really quite important. Bring it on, the skepticism, he's saying, because it is good to see just how tenuous, that is, how shaky, how rattly our historical knowledge of the past is. Hopefully, this will lead to greater reasonableness in pressing historical claims. I find it equally annoying when Christian apologists try to place the evidence for the historical Jesus on par with the evidence for Alexander the Great or Augustus. And I am in complete agreement with him here. That is so laughably false, it beggars belief that any educated person could say that with a straight face. Yeah, that's just idiotic Christian apologetics. Has no place in intellectual discourse or historical discourse or scientific discourse or internet discourse, but it does happen. And yet, very smart, educated people do say it. So we're stuck with that. So the truth is that history was never necessary to uphold religion in general or Christianity in particular. Now, this might, kind of earthquake, shake some people up a little. So let's see how he means this. Let's see his interpretation. The truth is that history was never necessary in order to hold up religion in general or Christianity in particular. And that automatically, truly, would extend into Mormonism, which claims to be a restoration of this very Christianity that history isn't even necessary to support. Right? So here's why. And this is really important because it's why I'm writing my novel. Human beings tell stories. And human beings think about their meanings. Now, we all experience uncanny things. We all, as human beings, wonder why, and we try to explain them. Religion is going nowhere. It may take many new or different forms, but mythicism is no challenge to it. Mythicism is just one tool for thinking about how religion works. Mythicism is only a threat to brittle fundamentalism. Ba-da-doom! I'm going to say that again. This is really good. Mythicism, that is the interpretation, the idea that I suspect by now most of us should at least understand the general basis. Jesus didn't really exist. He's all totally invented. That's mythicism in relation to the historical Jesus. But it is only a threat to brittle fundamentalism. I love that. That's a t-shirt right there. As a historian, and Kishkumen is a professional historian, I only find it counterproductive and annoying when it distorts perceptions of history. Very, very well said. And because, as he says, people saw plays anciently. I mean, that's what the Greeks did. That's why we have all these Euripides and all of those people, Sophocles and all of them, the Oedipus cycle, because they saw plays, they told stories, they listened to songs, they sang songs. There are many ways of coming into contact with myths. So could it be that arguing for demonic fakes is a way of using the myths to prove Jesus true? I mean, if Jesus wasn't real, why would demons be attempting to copy his story? That's interesting, huh? It's a brilliant, audacious, and repugnant move. Take Jesus's debt to classical culture and turn it against classical culture. So Jesus would not exist without classical culture. Neither would Christianity. Christianity is nothing more or less than the synthesis of the Hellenism, that is the Greek influence post-Alexander the Great, all the way up in through and past Jesus's day in Palestine, well, actually in the whole ancient Near East. So that is what Christianity is it is a combination, a synthesis of Hellenism and Judaism under Roman imperialism. Take away any of those things and there is no Christianity. You can believe that this is the will of God. I'm not saying that it isn't. I just think it's important to combat the anti-Hellenism, the anti-Greek stance that took root in Protestantism, nowhere more so than here in America, and got imported into Mormonism too. The good news for Kish, and I know he's aware of this, is they really have backed away from that particular interpretation of the Great Apostasy. Nibley was huge on this. It's all over in his ridiculous book, The World and the Prophets. Used to be a radio program. What was it, 1950? In the 1950s, I'll say. I can't remember, 52, 57, 59. Where he said Greek philosophy was the culprit. That was just an idiotic approach. They don't take that way now. Now, and here's Manetho. He says, let me check my time here real quick. Could I? Oh boy, wow. I'm done. Holy cow, I'm out of time. Oh, hi, Don Smith. How you doing? I said hi to Geoplanet Jane, didn't I? Hey, Lee Mortensen. Oh, and the last Goonie, good to see you. Trevor Luke, good to see you. All right. Oh, Anton Older. Mark Crispin. Yeah, baby. Welcome. You got here. You weren't here earlier when I did the yeah, baby, but I did it. So anyway, let me try to, there is just so much good quality stuff here from so many of these guys, but I don't want to keep you over too late. Manetho has a very good point. I recently came across, and I have seen these too, and this is a really important, here we are beginning to see the give and take between Richard Carrier and other scholars who are not necessarily Christian or not necessarily Jewish, and yet disagree. There's always going to be disagreement. That is a given, right? So I recently came across a series of videos by a scholar named Kip Davis. Kip Davis, my dear friend Derek Lambert of Myth Vision, shout out to you, good brother. He has had Kip Davis on many times. I would like to get Kip Davis on this program. He is really fun. He's a very knowledgeable, excellent with the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's picking apart Richard Carrier's use of Jewish texts in his claims about the Jesus myth. Davis isn't the foremost expert out there, but judging by his list of academic publications, his credentials are better than those of Carrier. And while I've only watched one video and part of another, it certainly sounds like Carrier has a habit of reading texts tendentiously, and that is one of Kishkumen's arguments. I know STEM isn't trying to slavishly adhere to Carrier's hypothesis. Now, we're not trying to slam dastardly STEM. We're just kind of we're working through the ins and outs of all of the various historical nuances that happened, not to mention the religious and the philosophical nuances that happen to go with this great, big, huge, gigantic thing we call Christianity and religion and Jesus, right? So he's not trying to slavishly adhere to Carrier's hypothesis. And at the start of this latest thread, he emphasized the Hellenistic parallels to the Jesus story more than the Jewish ones. But the Jewish elements of the Jesus story are obviously essential, and they are. And Carrier has become the most visible mythicist because he offers an explanation for them. The key points of the Jesus story were constructed out of pre-existing Jewish beliefs about the Messiah. But if the pre-existing beliefs don't fit the story, then it obviously weakens that explanation. All right, that makes sense. As I indicated in a previous post, I think Christianity originated in the cognitive dissonance triggered by Jesus's death. His followers thought he was the Messiah. So, after he died, the most committed of his followers maintained that messianic belief, in part by going back to the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, and finding scriptural parallels. And of course, we now know from our vantage point today, all of those parallels appear at least to be seriously stretched and distorted. So this explains how his death had been part of God's plan all along. But again, they had to go back through and reinterpret everything. This is exactly the same method that we find Joseph Smith did with all of his biblical revision, also utilizing current literature of his day, Adam Clarke's commentary for one item, potentially Josephus, things like that. So I could very well be off the beam. Nobody will ever know what really happened. This is true, but this hypothesis would explain why the Jesus story is set in the very specific time and place that it is, because that's when Jesus actually lived and died, and why Jesus doesn't fit the understanding of the Messiah that existed beforehand, because his most committed followers coped with his death by redefining the concept of Messiah in order to make Jesus fit into that new mold. That's how they dealt with the issue. I haven't seen any mythicist answer the first point, and the lack of an answer is one of my biggest frustrations with mythicism. Carrier has an answer to the second point, that the prior understanding of the Messiah is more Jesus-like than most scholars assume, but it doesn't seem to hold together very well. So that's my friend Manetho. And Kishkumen says, thanks so much for all this. I agree with you when you opine that cognitive dissonance regarding Jesus' execution is at the very root of Christianity. Turning his unexpected death into a divine plan with a purpose was a brilliant stroke that resulted in a powerful image of inversion of Roman imperial assumptions and values. So I think that's pretty much, oh, hang on, I've got one more page, just one more. Oh, and Physics Guy, another good friend of mine, genius mathematician and quantum physicist here. He's got. Are you going to get mad at me if I keep going for a few more minutes? I'm going to keep going for a few more minutes anyway, whether you're mad at me or not. This is really important. Physics guy always has pretty good points. He's not a Mormon. He's not even an American. He lives across the puddle over there. Here's what he says. The fact that Jesus' crucifixion was a horrible surprise for his disciples is no revisionist reading. It's clear in Christian tradition. Some gospel verses represent Jesus as telling his inner group about it in advance, if even vaguely, but even these texts show the disciples resisting this idea. So the Gospels criticize the disciples for not understanding where Jesus' mission was really going. And in spite of Jesus' own words and the supposedly clear and abundant prophecies, but this still says, first of all, that whether or not the disciples should have expected or even welcomed the crucifixion, they definitely didn't. So the tradition of the anguish in Gethsemane even implies that Jesus himself wasn't sure what would happen to him until the last moment. So there are even awkward details preserved in the Gospels that still hint at confusion among the disciples in the aftermath. Most of the accounts of post-resurrection appearances have people struggling to recognize Jesus, for example. So up to a point, you could say that this was all of a myth, and the disciples are in the myth as a dim-witted chorus, and this emphasizes the cosmic atonement dramatically by failing to understand it until the resurrection makes it clear even to them. So if that was the plan of the Gospels, it wasn't well executed. The story drags on for too long with preaching and miracle stuff that doesn't build up the cosmic significance of the passion. It even actually probably distracts from the passion. So the non-atonement part of the Jesus story doesn't work well as mere scaffolding for the cosmic atonement. It all really reads more as though the non-atonement material was just there and well enough known to the target audience that it could be spun. And the reason they wanted to spin it, of course, is to try to make sense of the crucifixion, but not simply suppressed. And Kishkumen says, excellent points, physics guy. As someone who thinks Jesus lived, I see your post as arguing in favor of the same view. There was a guy named Jesus who was crucified. His execution was a horrible blow to his followers, and they struggled with the tragedy, the impact on their beliefs of that tragedy. That is not the profile of a myth that was rewritten to read like a historical biography. That is an outstanding point. See, Kishkumen is the one responsible mainly for me to kind of step back out of the mythicist camp, which I probably inhabited for 3 or 4 years. Now I'm seeing it more or less the way Kishkumen has presented it from a professional historian point of view. That said, there was a story about a god who came to earth in the guise of one of his own priests. He was captured by city authorities, but he miraculously escaped, and he engineered the execution of his persecutor at the hands of his own mother. I am referring, of course, to Euripides' Bacchae, a Greek tragedy about Dionysus, returned to Thebes, written in the late 5th to early 4th century BC. It is interesting how similar it is to the Gospels in the New Testament, up to the point that the god Jesus is executed and his substitute, Barabbas, is released. And again, once again, Dennis R. McDonald and I have made a video of this, and we have talked about this on this channel, the Dionysian Gospel. He shows all the parallels and the good stuff in there. I personally find his case to be more persuasive than not, without question. Fun stuff to read. So with that, let's see, I'm on page 23. No, I'm on page 24. Right, that's how I see it too, physics guy says. Yeah, so that's that for that. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other. I have 5 other long 15 to 20 pages worth of discussions that I could keep going, but I'm not going to do that to you tonight. I think I will just make this a really big series on the historical Jesus, and we'll call it good. So it looks like almost everybody has gone, which is probably a good thing. I've gone over the limit. So that's pretty much it on the historical Jesus of why there really could have been a historical man named Jesus. All else is pure theological interpretation that obviously argues, fights, and kills all the other interpretations, as it is allowed to have that kind of ridiculously stupid power through the centuries. Thank God we have American democracy for now that puts a curb to their idiotic world domination ambitions, even though they say, don't think about this world, the reward is in heaven. Well, then tell those bastards to give everybody else their money back. We're talking major hypocrisy as far as that goes. So, you can always find something wrong with it. So thanks, you guys, for being here in my audience. Appreciate you. Hope you enjoyed yourselves. I personally really like this kind of stuff. It's fun stuff to explore, understand, and review and re-review, as it also helps us begin to appreciate other wider literatures such as the Greeks, perhaps the Persians. We didn't get into the Gnostic materials, but we could. The Enochic materials, the Pseudepigrapha, the Old Testament, New Testament, and all that. Just a lot of fun material that everybody is looking at. So I'm going to head out now. Thank you. Be good, do well, have fun, work hard, make lots of friends, smile a lot, and remember above all else, and if you forget this, you're in the wrong. The Backyard Professor thinks you guys are awesome. See you next time.